Hi Booktube, it's Amy. I'm back with Orcutt's Kingdom of Books, and today I'm on chapter titled Books in the Cradle. And Orcutt begins with an anecdote about what happens when we as book lovers gush over a certain book, perhaps the confusion of our friends, and realize perhaps our error as they are completely baffled by us. So this chapter is called Books in the Cradle. A good many years ago, a friend came to my house at a time when I was still exuberant over a recent find in a secondhand bookstore in Rome, and I proudly, too proudly I fear, exhibited the volume for his admiration. This, I said probably with more emphasis than I realized, was printed by Nicholas Jensen in Venice in 1475. It is my first incunabula. He was courteous enough to listen attentively to all I said, and examine the book with seeming interest. But I could not help feeling that he had failed to appreciate the full importance of this event. The following day my friend sent me a note. After leaving your house last evening, it ran, I whispered cautiously to my wife, "Do you know what an incunabula is?" To my infinite relief, she acknowledged her own ignorance. As soon as we reached the home, we resorted to the dictionary. Incunabula, from the Latin words in and cunabula, meaning in the cradle, infancy, of the art of printing, applied to all volumes printed before the end of the year 1500. We turned to each other, thrilled by the pride of intellectual acquisition. Then we went upstairs and looked down upon our offspring sleeping in his cunabulum and understood. I had not meant to be pedantic. If my friend had seen fit to discourse upon the subject of electricity, in which he was an expert, he would have found my enthusiasm even less intelligent than his own expression over books. For such is the defensive reaction to conceal our lack of knowledge. My only excuse for assuming that his horizon was broader than mine was that books are more intimate things than watts and more personal than amperes. As I look back now upon this particular experience, I must admit that I did not give my friend even half a chance. I had forgotten how forbidding the word incunabula had sounded to me before it automatically changed itself into the more inviting cradle of books, and opened up before me with alluring prospects a new adventure. Even after acquiring my Jensen incunabula as a species did not begin to have the significance for me which they afterward assumed. When I began to explore this hitherto unknown field, I found myself in the position of a child, to whom at first everything is strange, but I had the advantage of maturity and gaining deeper satisfaction because of the greater understanding that is the compensation of the years. The child asks searching questions regarding events and surroundings which are commonplace to his elders, and in the enlightenment that comes with the unfolded knowledge, receives thrills unimagined by his instructor. By the same token, I stood before the unfamiliar, asking questions which I quickly found could be answered only by personal investigation. The main road I started to explore was intersected by many bypaths, and the rewards gained by departures from the beaten track proved so rich that the quest lured me on and on. From the very beginning, I have approached the Cradle books as human documents, rather than as bibliographical or typographical exhibits. At first, in my inexperience, I must admit that I was a bit skeptical in accepting the generally accredited fact that the volumes of the 15th century had never been surpassed in taste or workmanship by later printers. This seemed incredible when I considered the tremendous improvements in mechanical equipment, but the evidence was overwhelming. The master book builders of the 15th century, handicapped as they were by the limitations of a newborn art, established a standard which has ever remained the objective of their successors. Then came the Natural Quarry. How did they do it? It could not just have happened. What were the obstacles those intrepid pioneers were forced to overcome? What were the economic, political, and ecclesiastical conditions under which these volumes were produced? What influences brought them into being, and what influence did they themselves exert? If I could discover the answers to these questions, how much more these books would really mean to me. From that moment, all that was astir or forbidding in the word incunabula vanished. In it, I now saw an invitation to explore the mysteries of that extraordinary period, during which the Dark Ages slipped into the background and medievalism became forgotten and the glories of the Renaissance began to beckon. My first experiences were a bit bewildering. During the last half of the 15th century, no less than 212 towns and cities in Europe had well-established presses, and the number of titles and reprints issued exceeds 36,000. Of this tremendous number, it was obvious that only a small percentage could really be classified as the product of an art. But I was deeply impressed by the fact that the physical side of book building proved an attraction to so many. This in itself gave me a striking commentary on the times, and surrounded even the inferior examples with a definite significance. These volumes, printed in different countries by different printers under untried conditions, seemed to me nothing less than a declaration of independence on the part of a world eager and determined to secure knowledge. No longer was learning to be confined to the fortunate few who could pay the excessive cost of the handwritten volumes. Laboriously produced and limited in number, no longer could the wealthy princes presume to hold their political power through the ignorance of the masses. These first printed books, by supplying information concerning spiritual and material things, opened the door to a world until then forbidden, and marked the turning point in history by giving the people a powerful weapon with which to fight against bigotry and oppression. They were not merely examples of the art of printing, but were rather mirrors in which were reflected the true beginnings of modern civilization. My next step was to persuade these Cradle books to take me into their confidence. A talkative book always appeals to me. I asked them to reveal why the Bible was the first volume printed in Germany, why the Latin classics supplied the text for so many of the earliest Italian publications, why in England the first book printed should have been an historical romance. However much a maker of books might consider printing as an art, he would naturally look upon his labor as a livelihood, and in selecting the titles of his publications, he must have had an eye to what his prospective clients would care to buy. So, thanks to the friendly volumes, I found myself in Germany at Mainz and John Gutenberg and Faust and Schoeffer. The Gutenberg Bible passed out of the atmosphere of the auction room and became a human document. Albrecht Pfister in Bamberg produced ponderous tomes, printed, by the way, in the same type used in the 36-line Bible in Strasbourg. John Mentelin issued equally heavy literature, which could appeal only to the most highly developed scholarly minds. In Cologne, Ulrich Zell was devoting himself to the lesser treatise on theology, for which he found a market among the priests. But perhaps his greatest fame comes from his testimony that Gutenberg was the inventor of printing in the Cologne Chronicle of 1499. Rivals of Zell in Cologne were Arnold Thayer Horan, who was the first to use a title page, and John Kohlhoff, the earliest printer to place signature marks on his printed sheets to aid the binder in collating the folded sheets. In 1468, Gunther Zehner issued some Latin meditations on the life of Christ in Augsburg, which city had already become famous for woodcuts of the saints. Koberger added to the list of ecclesiastical publications by the numerous volumes he published in Nuremberg, and so it went, a heavy list in all consciousness. In the ecclesiastical group, the Bible naturally held first position in popularity. Then came missals, psalmsters, antiphanaries, and church service books. Akin to these were the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Jerome, and particularly St. Augustine's De Civitate Dei and the Imitations of Thomas à Kempis. All these were printed in Latin, which was the language universally understood by those who are able to read. An absurd story which should be classed among the legends, but is of interest in emphasizing the bestseller of the period, is that of Dr. Faustus and the Devil, Faustus being John Faust of the famous early printing house of Faust and Schoeffer, Gutenberg's associates and successors. It is alleged that before the discovery of the art of printing became known in France, Dr. Faustus took to Paris a number of Bibles which he and Schoeffer had printed, and offered them for sale as manuscript volumes at 60 crowns each, which was the full price charged for a handwritten Bible. Later he reduced the price to 30 crowns, which caused universal astonishment, but when at last he came down to 20 crowns a volume and produced the book in rapid succession, All Paris became agitated. The uniformity of the copies only increased the wonder and alarm of the people, as it seemed to them to be beyond the power of human invention. Information was given to the authorities, charging Faust with being a magician. His lodgings were searched, and a large number of Bibles were found and seized. The red ink with which the volumes were embellished was said to be his blood, and he was adjudged as being in league with the devil. The story goes that he was cast into prison, and in order to save his life, he was obliged to make known the discovery of the art of printing. Wolcas, 1609, insists upon the accuracy of this story, citing as corroborative evidence the fact that Faust died in Paris of the plague in 1466. I need give no more data than these Cradle books have already given me to form in my mind an accurate picture of the life and customs of the German nation during the last half of the 15th century. All over the world, intelligent people were particularly concerned in scholastic theology, considering that their material welfare was absolutely wrapped up with the spiritual, and they sought to familiarize themselves with the various tenets as a vital part of their everyday life. But in other countries, a leaven was introduced by reading the classics and even volumes upon secular subjects. When, because of a wider market and easier access to original manuscripts, printing as an art passed from Germany to Italy, I was quite ready to go with it. Yet it was an ecclesiastical volume which first guided me to the new field, Lyra's Expositions Librium Virtus et Novi Testamenti, printed by Swedenheim Panarts at Rome in 1472. Could any title be more forbidding to the seeker of adventure? Somewhere had learned that in this book I should find the famous petition made by the printers to Pope Sixtus, in which they recorded the titles they had printed and the number of copies of each issue. And here is a facsimile of a page of that petition. I was curious to check these in arriving at the average size of the early editions. I found the pages and they served their purpose, but I also discovered in the volume much beyond that for which I sought. The book asserted its personality and took me with it to Subiaco. In 1464, Joan Turcometa, the learned abbot of the monastery of St. Scholasta, impressed by the importance of Gutenberg's marvelous discovery, succeeded in persuading Conrad Sweynhem and Arnold Panarts, two Germans who had learned the art of printing, perhaps in Gutenberg's office, to set up in the monastery the earliest printing establishment in Italy. And so the religious nature of these Subiaco volumes was an echo from Germany. As the tale unfolded, I learned of the terrific obstacles encountered in this pioneer exploit. In a small town some 30 miles from Rome, of the heroic efforts of Father Joan, who later became a cardinal, and the stout-hearted printers, which actually bore fruit in the Subiaco publications of 1464 to 1467, and finally of the reluctant decision of Sweynheim and Panarts to accept the invitation received from the brothers Massimi to transfer themselves to the Massimi Palace in Rome, where they hoped to pursue their labors amid more promising surroundings. When I was made a part of the continuing adventures of these pioneers in producing the earliest volumes printed in Rome, of which this uninviting title is one. The petition contains more than titles and figures. It is an appeal to Pope Sixtus to come to the aid of the new art by subsidizing the publications. Our house, the printers declare, rather large, is filled with printed sheets, but is empty of everything necessary to life. And this list of titles, now of such supreme bibliographical value, was originally made to impress upon the pontiff the importance of their efforts. By this time, Lyra's commentary had become more than a rare volume, more than an example of printing. Its makers have assumed a real personality, and I find myself sympathizing with them in their disappointment when their petition fell upon deaf ears. I have almost forgotten my original purpose in examining it, and the gratification I found in its contributing evidence that the number of copies in those 15th century editions was about 500. In those days, of course, all printing was done directly from the type. and an average page required perhaps 10 pounds. Few printers owned type enough for even one entire volume. This procedure being to set as much as they could print, distribute, and then set again as the work went on. If a second edition were required, this labor had to be repeated. All this would seem to show that unless a printer could sell at least 500 copies of an edition, he would hesitate to venture upon the undertaking, which, from the figures already mentioned, would seem a fair average. The Swanhem and the Penart's titles actually average 445 to an edition. As a result of the humanistic movement, that forerunner and essence of the Renaissance, it was natural that the early Italian printers should soon break away from ecclesiastical literature and select the classics as most likely to find a market. To the educated Italian of the 15th century, they were as familiar as Dickens and Thackeray are to our generation. If not Virgil or Plato, or at least Ovid's De Arte Amade et de Remedio Amoris, was an integral part of every well-educated household. I found myself in Venice, where I might easily spend the rest of my natural life in listening to the stories told by the Cradle books issued by no less than 150 competing presses. There is no John of Spires, the earliest Venetian printer who, but for his early death, might have saved historians much embarrassment. For he had secured from the Senate the exclusive right to print in Venice for 5 years. Cicero, Pliny, and St. Augustine were his contributions. John's brother, Vendelin of Spire, succeeded to the business, but the monopoly ceased with John's death, and the name of the competing printers became legion. Nicholas Jensen promptly established himself in 1470 and achieved eternal fame by cutting a Roman type so beautiful and so basically correct that it has served as the model for the best type designs which have since been cut. There were Christopher Valdefer and Franz Renner and Enhart Ratold, and the brothers Giovanni and Gregorio de Gregori, and that great master of them all, Eldus Manitus, with whom we are already well acquainted. Some say that over 4,000 titles owe their origins to Venice alone, including every sort of literature that can be imagined. Ratold specialized in astronomy, mathematics, and history, but he is best known for his successful combination of type and decoration. The Italian love for decoration encouraged the 15th century printers in that country to enrich their volumes by adding illustrations cut on wood. The introduction of woodcuts came earlier in Germany, but in connection with volumes so heavy and serious in subject as to preclude beauty or lightness of design. The popularity of the profane classics and of other secular books in Italy gave the Italian printers a splendid opportunity to combine the arts of printing and of woodcutting in a charming manner. These supply added information as to the taste, the customs, and the manners of the people of the period. One of the most popular romances of the 15th century, which would never be suspected from its title, was the Hypernatomachia Polyphio's Strife of Love in a Dream, issued by Eldus Manitus from his press in Venice in 1499, undertaken at the expense of Leonardo Crasso of Verona, who dedicated the book to Guidobaldi, Duke of Urbino. The book was written by a Dominican friar, Francesco Colonna, and since the volume was to have no title page after the custom of the time, its author adopted the ingenious method of so arranging his chapters that the successive initial letters make up a sentence which translated reads, "Brother Francesco Colonna greatly loved Pelia." In the opening chapter, Peleo tells her nymphs that her real name was Lucretia. And from this, I'm just going to pause here because we have a reproduction of a page of this famous romance here. And I actually discovered when I first read this chapter last night that this romance has been reprinted, and so it's certainly something that I would like to come across and maybe dip into a bit and see if it's any good, or at the very least interesting. In the opening chapter, Pelia tells her nymphs that her real name was Lucretia, and that from this information the heroine has been identified as Lucretia Lioli, daughter of the jurisconsult of Treviso, who entered a convent after having been attacked by the plague. A brief outline of the plot shows what sort of story appealed to the readers of the 15th century. Paleophilo, the hero, imagines himself in his dream as passing through a dark wood until he reaches a small stream, by the side of which he rests. The valley through which the stream runs is filled with fragments of ancient architecture, which form the subjects of many of the illustrations. As he comes to a great gate, he is threatened by a dragon. He escapes from this and meets 5 nymphs, who take him to the court of their queen. The queen's palace is fully described, as are also 4 magnificent processions, the triumphs of Europa, Leda, Danae, and the festival of Bacchus. Then comes a triumph of Vertumnus and Pomona, and a splendid picture of nymphs and men sacrificing before a terminal figure of Priapus. In the meantime, Polypheo has met the fair Polia, and together they witness some of the ceremonies in the temple of Venus, viewing its ornaments and those in the garden around it. The second book tells how the beautiful Polia, after an attack of the plague, takes refuge in the temple of Diana. While there, she dreams a terrifying dream of the anger of Cupid, and so that she is moved to allow her lover to embrace her, and because of this is driven from the temple of Diana with sticks. And lastly, how Venus takes the lovers under protection, and at the prayer of Polyphilo causes Cupid to pierce an image of Polia with his dart, thereby fixing Polia's affections firmly upon her devoted admirer. In Florence, Cennini issued his Virgil, 1471, and Petri a year afterwards, the Filocco of Boccaccio and the Trionfia Petrarch. Later, the Florentine press showed marked interest and skill in producing illustrated volumes, and during the last decade of the century, this city might have competed with Lyons in the publication of secular literature, except for the influence of Savonarola. The personality of this great preacher carried the masses completely off their feet, and his sermons, in the form of printed and illustrated tracts, were sold literally by the thousands. In their frenzy of enthusiasm, the people were moved to burn even the most precious of their secular volumes, and then, almost before the leaves of the profane books turned into ashes, these extraordinary Florentines, the product of the most inexplicable period in the world's history, completely reversed their attitude and burned the preacher himself. Who would dare to say what sort of reading they really preferred? The art of printing can scarcely be said to have been in its infancy in Italy after 1474, for by that time Italian printers, especially in Venice, were supplying all the world with books. This makes it a bit more difficult for our Cradle books to tell their story. Yet they have already given ample testimony that Italy must have been a far more interesting country in which to live than Germany. One of the most interesting communications passed on to me by the 15er classics was the story of the bitter warfare waged between the purists, who sought to hold the Latin language true to the cold elegance of the Ciceronian style, and those equally zealous and sincere who strove to maintain it near to the vernacular, in which form it had proved a serviceable medium of conversation, even between those who could not read. The Ciceronians won as a result which you and I were enabled to learn classical Latin, and later, perhaps, to appreciate its beauty. But the very perfection of the Ciceronian style limited its usefulness, and the outcome of the struggle put an end to the use of Latin as the common means of human communication. What a pity that zealous advocates of an international language have never hit upon the idea of restoring Latin instead of laboring to introduce the composite Esperanto. The part played by the printing press in this momentous struggle was more vital than could have been supposed at the time. The printers of the 15th century tried to hold themselves neutral, but perhaps unknowingly, and surely without intention, they actually fostered the vernacular languages, and by giving them permanence, helped to deliver the death blow to Latin as a language of common understanding. This new viewpoint suggested by the Cradle books encouraged me to inquire more deeply into the influence of the printing press, enforcing the national languages of Europe to become permanent. When the knowledge of a people becomes dependent upon reading rather than upon oral discussion and study of pictorial design, dialects become obstacles. When William Caxton in 1476 moved his press from Burgess to London, Edward was King of England. The battle cries of the Lancastrians and the House of York had scarcely died away, and Caxton found the English language broken up into numerous confusing variants. Blind Harry, the minstrel, might sing the deeds of William Wallace in whatever dialect he chose, and he would still draw his little crowd around him. But to print books which should have a general appeal, some one of these variants, the one more generally in use, had to be adopted, and by its adoption this particular variant became nationalized. When I came to France, my Cradle books introduced me to a very different life from that disclosed by their German and Italian cousins. For in everything French, as Bourdieu says, their philosophies, their religions, their arts, their drudgeries, there is a certain breathlessness, as of things that have to keep up with the pace of an advancing universe, to ride always on the foam crest of the foremost wave. While the earliest books printed at Paris and the Sorbonne were classical, it is at Lyons that we think when French 15ers are mentioned. Lyons, the headquarters for the light literature of the period. Here the printers produced their popular romances, folk songs, and legends printed in the vernacular, while the presses in other localities were turning out theology and the classics in Latin. There were almost as many printing offices in Lyons as there were in Paris, and the frequent Lyonnese affairs attracted visitors from all over Europe. The printers of Lyons were not restricted by the theological censorship which at this time was so active in Paris. Of the secular publications at Lyons, there is one title, the Roman de la Rose, which has always appealed to me more than all the others. It is one of those volumes that has made Cradle books for me something more than memorials of the early artist printers. For no less than 3 centuries, first in manuscript and later in printed form, this textbook of all lovers enjoyed a wonderful popularity. And it is a curious fact that the demand only began to wane when ambitious but misguided publishers, in the editions issued after 1500, sought to appeal to a less intelligent class by cheapening the physical appearance. The copies of this famous book, printed in the 15th century, contain mute but eloquent evidence of its universal acceptance as the lover's Bible. In one copy I found certain lines underscored, in another a simple date written in the margin. It required but little imagination to turn back the centuries and form in my mind's eye a picture of those whose hands had previously held these very volumes. These books were no longer incunabula, but living records of human lives. Perhaps the lovers had held the book between them, startled to find recorded in the page those very emotions which until then they had supposed were sacred to themselves. And the date in the margin? Who shall say? It may be a symbol of a tryst kept or broken, of a faith rewarded or abused. But there it stands. If a record of a guilty secret, it has at least its human appeal. And here is a reproduction of a page from the Lover's Bible. Oh, and I just lost my bookmark here from the page that I was reading. So I'll have to re-find my page later. Because in my actual reading, I'm several chapters beyond what I'm reading aloud to you now. So the first printed copy, oh no, that's not where we're at. Guillaume Dolores wrote the first portion of the poem, and in the story the author tells us that he was 25 years old. This youth, presumably about the year 1237, wrote a charming allegory which is an ancestor of Pilgrim's Progress. The pages are full of joy and happiness, and in them delightful young people of the 13th century are personified, surrounded by singing birds and blooming flowers, to all intents and purposes, as 20th century characters might be portrayed today. The poem is full of the buoyancy and optimism of youth. When about half finished, the poet died, and the fragment lay unpublished for 40 years. Until another youth, Jean Demain, discovered and completed it. The work of the two writers is easily distinguished by the abrupt disappearance of the light-hearted approach to life, for which is now substituted a cynical humor that changes romance into satire. The first printed copy is credited to Urtuin and Chenec of Lyons, and the date is put at about 1481. The second is attributed to Jean Cyber of Lyons, printed about 1485. The third is assigned to Guillaume Leroy of Lyons, about 1487. No one of these issues contains any directly distinguishing marks, and I was curious to know how the experts could so confidently classify each in its proper chronological place and establish the approximate date. The type, the nature of the illustrations, and the watermarks in the paper all played these parts. The watermarks in number 1 are Lyonese, and the woodcuts resemble in style those in other Lyons books. And one of the copies of number 1 at the Bibliothèque Nationale contains the name of a well-known Lyons lady as its first owner. So the place of its origin is easily established, but equally convincing evidence shows that 2 other folios were also printed in Lyons, so the order of precedence required further study. The type in the copy now accepted as the earliest is unusual. In the Royal Library at Dresden there is a volume printed in the same type, which contains a rubricator's note dated 1481. The only printers known to have used this face are Urtuin and Chenec. The type in number 2 is identical with the Venetian face used by Jean Cyber in books printed in 1482 and 1483. And from its worn appearance, as compared with these volumes, the Roman de la Rose appears to have been printed later. In the copy assigned to Leroy, the type is identical with that used by him in several volumes, one of which is dated 1486. Thus, bibliographers establish the priority with absolute confidence. To browse among the Cradle books of the Netherlands is to find oneself at once involved in the old controversy of Lawrence Koster against John Gutenberg as the inventor of the art of printing. I confess myself unusually cautious in approaching this topic owing to an experience years ago when my elder son was a small boy. One evening at dinner, he asked me to tell him the story of the invention of printing. Being in a casual frame of mind, I related this atrocious yarn. Once upon a time, years and years ago, there was a small boy who had a birthday. On this most important occasion, his parents presented him with a jackknife and a white linen suit. Proud of his new possessions, the small boy wandered forth in the fields in search of adventure. As he went, he picked red cranberries by the way, which he placed in a pocket of his new white suit. At length the small boy found himself near a monastery, in front of which were standing several chairs newly made of soft wood, placed in the sun for the glue to dry. In the small boy's mind there seemed to be some association between those softwood chairs and the new knife, and before the story could be told, the new knife had carved out an initial in the seat of one of the new chairs. Responding to the inborn love of color, the small boy crushed his red cranberries into the carved initial and then drew away to regard the result of his handiwork. Just at that moment, one of the monks came out from the monastery to look at the chairs. The small boy was alarmed. In order to conceal his mischief, he quickly seated himself in the chair he had just decorated and greeted the monk with an expression on his face such as the cat wears after eating the canary. The monk at once saw what had happened, and he took the small boy across his knee to spank him for this naughty behavior. There, upon the seat of the new white trousers, was an impression of the first rubricated initial. The monk, being a learned man, was seized with an inspiration. On the promise of escape from punishment, the small boy gladly agreed not to disclose what had happened. And they went inside the monastery together. Here the monk and the small boy set the earliest printing establishment. The monk carved out on the seat of a softwood chair the letters he wished to print. Then he bruised some cranberries in the letters, and seizing the small boy by the neck, he pressed him first upon the seat of the chair and then upon a sheet of white paper. And this method of printing was followed until the small boy became wore out. It seemed to me that this made a perfectly good story, but when I met my son the following afternoon, I found myself most unpopular. It appeared that he had been given this subject as a school exercise, and when he had repeated the absurd story I had told him, he was taken seriously to task. I succeeded in assuming the responsibility, but since then I have declined to be drawn into any discussion regarding the invention of printing. What has become of the hundreds of thousands of Cradle books which were printed during those last 50 years of the 15th century? Thousands of them are in private libraries, many really worthless in spite of their early date, because they are not included among the volumes which represent the work of the best printers, or because they have no story to tell. Some of them were mutilated by later would-be historians of the art of printing in gathering their material. In the British Museum are nearly 100 scrapbooks which represent one of these exploits. They were made in the 17th century by an Englishman named John Bagford, who aspired to write a history of printing. His notion of collecting material was to tear ruthlessly whatever pages interested him from volumes which came into his hands, and these scrapbooks contained relics of not less than 25,000 early printed volumes. Some authorities, like Thomas Hearne and W.Y. Fletcher, eulogized Bagford for having preserved for posterity even fragments of publications, some of which would otherwise have disappeared. Others, like William Blades and Dibbon, do not hesitate to dub him a wicked old biblioclast and a literary monster. At all events, an examination of this material clearly shows why such a large percentage disappeared through natural causes, and to that extent we may forgive Bagford. For the scrapbooks include leaves from pamphlets and volumes obviously of but transitory interest or value, printed to satisfy a passing popular demand. This might be some phase of a religious subject. Oops, somebody's calling me, but I'm just going to ignore that. I'll call her back later. At all events, an examination of this material clearly shows why such a large percentage disappeared through natural causes, and to that extent we may forgive Bagford. For the scrapbooks include leaves from pamphlets and volumes, obviously of transitory interest or value, printed to satisfy a passing popular demand. This might be some phase of a religious subject, some inexpensive edition of a popular classical author, the ballads of the day, or some other unimportant publication of secular nature, hawked about by an itinerant peddler of the 15th century or later. It requires more than an early date upon a volume, even of this important period, to give it value. Think of the millions of pamphlets and books printed today, which are not prized enough even to be placed on a library shelf after being read. But we must raise our eyebrows at Bagford when we find in his scrapbook leaves filched from volumes printed by William Caxton, by Pinson, and by Winnick de Worde from the 1602 edition of Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, of which only a single copy is now known to exist, and even an illuminated leaf from the Gutenberg Bible itself. In my adventuring, I have merely scratched the surface of the subject opened up by the Cradle of Books. One might spend his life wandering along this single bypath, and then regret that the span of years was all too short. But even browsing about as I have done, I have picked up much that has added to my understanding and appreciation of the book. The more I study, the more solicitous I become of the estimate that future generations will make of our own times, by applying the same analytical tests and arriving at equally definite conclusions. Are we content to be judged by the volumes we are producing today? It is certain that we shall be judged. The standard of our workmanship, the demands of our intelligence, the spiritual and the material expressions of our personalities, all will be put into the scales on one side or the other. In estimating the place of the 20th century, in estimating the place we of the 20th century shall occupy in the history of civilization, for books are witnesses that cannot be coerced or discredited. They stand for what they are, today as they did 4.5 centuries ago, and will be accepted as reflections of an era, in some ways as extraordinary and perplexing as that which gave birth to the Cradle of Books of the 15th century. So there we go, Cradle books. And I think it's interesting his musing about how books of the 20th century will be recalled, and their craftsmanship too, because I mean, you look at this book and it's certainly not, you know, an expensively made book, but it's a well-crafted book. It's lasted almost 100 years here, and I think he would be astonished and perhaps horrified at the sort of books that are commonly turned out today, books really that aren't designed to last more than a few readings hardly. I mean, you get a paperback and 5 years later it's yellowed and falling apart, and meanwhile you have books 100 years old, 150 years old that are still holding up quite nicely. But so that was that chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're all having a lovely day.